Shalom, and welcome to V'ahavta Yisrael, a Hebrew phrase which means you shall love Israel. We hope you'll stay with us for the next 30 minutes as our teacher, Dr. Baruch, shares his expository teaching from the Bible. Dr. Baruch is the senior lecturer at the Zera Avraham Institute based in Israel. Although all courses are taught in Hebrew at the Institute, Dr. Baruch is pleased to share this weekly address in English. To find out more about our work in Israel, please visit us on the web at LoveIsrael.org. That's one word, LoveIsrael.org. Now, here's Baruch with today's lesson.
God loves justice. He commands us to pursue and chase after peace. And obviously, there's a relationship between justice and peace. Without justice, there is no peace. Without peace, there is no righteousness. All of these words biblically are related. So let me ask you a question. How committed are you to the right judgment? Justice being given to all people, not some, but everyone. Learn an important principle, and that is when you deny someone justice, then you are inviting upon yourself the judgment of God. Well, take out your Bible and look with me to the book of Isaiah in chapter 10. Now, in this lesson, we're going to see that what we study can be broken up into two sections. The first section, which is chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, really is a continuation of what we were studying in chapter 9. And then when we begin in verse 5, verses 5 through 18, we're going to see the beginning of God speaking about judgment upon his people, and that he is going to use Assyria, the Hebrew word Ashur, Assyria, to mediate this justice upon his people. So without any further delay, let's begin. Take out your Bible. Look with me to the book of Isaiah and chapter 10. Now, the chapter begins with the word hoi, which is a word of admonition. It is a warning. Hoi means how awful something's going to be. It is a term of stopping. It is command. Cut this out. Do not continue in this way, because if you do, the outcomes are going to be disastrous. So when we look at verse 1 of chapter 10, we see that phrase, woe. Some Bibles in English will translate it alas, which simply means something bad is on the way, so we need to change our behavior. So he says in verse 1, woe to the ones who legislate legislations of wickedness. Now, it is oftentimes translated those who make laws, and that's fine. It's not the word Torah, which is instruction, oftentimes translated with the word law, which is fine. But its root here is the word chok, which is a judgment. It is a decree. So he's warning, he's saying how awful it's going to be to those who make legislation. And this legislation is legislations of wickedness. And letters, and this is a word for, in modern Hebrew, it's just that. It's a word for writing a letter. But in ancient Hebrew, this term could be for a written decree that was sent among the people and read publicly. So it's a sense of a proclamation. And again, these are proclamations that are written, that have a outcome of, the Hebrew word is amal, which is that which is troublesome, that which brings grief. So God says, woe to those who make legislation and have proclamations that are wickedness, and the outcome of such wicked decrees is grief for others. There's going to be people who are suffering. So learn this principle. When I am part of something that denies someone else justice, receiving the right judgment, when I deny someone, or when leaders deny those in their society, citizens of justice, it is going to produce wickedness. It is going to be something that causes grief and trouble, and God's aware of that, and he says, woe to such individuals. Move on to verse 2. Here we have a word of distortion, that which twists or refrain. It simply places upon an individual something, and the context is something that is not good. So who places upon the dalim. This is those who have meager resources. It is a synonym for the word poor. We'll come to the word poor also in this verse in a moment, but it's a different word. There are those who are in poverty, and there are those who have such meager things in their life. And usually when someone is in that situation where they have great lacking, they also have very little power within that society. So God watches over them, and he again warns those who basically denies judgment from those who are poor. And he says again, the same context, we have to look back to verse 1 that gets the emphasis of what he's saying. Woe to those, in other words, who still, the word here is the word ligzol, who still justice. Justice from who? The poor ones of my people. So he's warning his covenant people. God has higher expectations for them. They have been given his instruction, his law, his Torah, his commandments to regulate society, to teach us how to behave. And the leadership here primarily of Israel, but also that southern kingdom, Judah. They are kingdoms of injustice, whose judgments are judgments of wickedness, who deny, refrain, distort those proper justice for those who are weak in society. Keep reading in the second part of verse 2. He says, to the ones who make or create a situation where the assets of widows and the provision of orphans are taken away. Now, he uses two words here for plundering and for taking spoil. And he's talking about how in society it's no different. He uses language which usually refers to an army coming and defeating a people. And because of this army's victory, it can just take away the assets, the resources, the wealth, the provision of those who are defeated. And we usually use those terms, spoil or plunder or booty, those three words, in order to describe this. And now it's saying that individuals are using their powers to do that same thing. It's referring to a most exploitive society. And that's not what Israel, God's covenant people, are supposed to be creating. So he's warning the people, and look now to verse 3. What happens? What happens when God's people build up, live in a way that produces injustice, and the judgments that are made by the leaders are judgments that deny people justice, righteousness, and is utilized in order to strip things away from the people, to steal what little they have, to take that away. What can we expect? Well, look at verse 3. In verse 3, we have the phrase, and what will you do for the day of visitation? Now, the word here is the word pikudah. Usually, the word pikudah is an order, a commandment. For example, it's oftentimes used for a military officer commanding one under his authority. He gives him an order, a command, an edict, however you want to understand this. But this word in the verbal form is frequent within the prophets, especially the prophet Jeremiah. And it speaks about God getting involved, God coming into a situation. And God, when he gets involved, he's all in. He's totally involved in what captures his attention, where he is moving. And it can be to deliver people or punish people. And this context is the day that he visits, and visits for judgment. So he says to his people, he says, what will you do in the day of visitation when I come and I get involved in your society? And then he says also, he uses a word that's very well known among the Jewish community, the word Shoah. Shoah is the Hebrew word for Holocaust. And so it speaks about a disastrous event. And he says, what will you do when I visit and bring about a disaster, a horrible catastrophe? He says, it's from a distance now, but it's coming. What will you do? And to whom will you flee to find help? And where will you leave your glory? Meaning those things that you saw as glorious, those what we could understand as treasured possessions. Where are you going to put them at that time? It speaks about God, him taking away. As the measure you use will be measured back to you. They have impoverished people, and God's saying, don't think that there's a place that you can deposit those assets of yours, those treasured things, that which gives you so much satisfaction and pleasure and self-glory. Don't think there's going to be a place that you can deposit them, or a place that you're going to find those who will help you. Verse 4. Bilti, here it is, without me. It is a synonym for biladai, without me. And it uses the word for bowing down, bending the knee, being brought to submissiveness. Among what? Among the Assyr. Assyr is a prisoner. So he says, you are going to be made to bow down among being taken prisoner. Secondly, he says, keep reading in this 4th verse, and also in the midst of the dead, that they will fall. He's saying here, some of you are going to be taken prisoners, others of you are going to fall among the dead. That's what's going to happen when God visits his people, when he puts things in order. And here's another biblical truth which you need to learn, and that's this. When I deny others justice, when I have rules that I follow, judgments that I follow that exploit others, what is going to be the outcome of that? Such behavior, when I take advantage of other people, that causes God, maybe tomorrow, it may be in a week, it may be in a year, but his punishment will come. God's going to get totally involved in that situation. So when I am unkind to a person, that is inviting God's judgment into my life. That's what he's telling his covenant people, that he expects more. They have been instructed with his word, his commandments, his statutes. And when they take this and reject it and legislate things which are of wickedness, things that deny justice to the poor, the needy, the widow, the orphan, such behavior, notice what it says, such behavior will bring you to submissiveness in prisons or will cause you to fall among the dead. Look at the end of verse 4. This is the fourth time. When we were in chapter 9, it appeared 3 times. This is the fourth time that we see this phrase. Because lo shav apo. Even though that God's going to do all of this, what he's been saying, nevertheless, this intense punishment is not going to bring about an end. God's not going to begin it and stop. He's not going to withdraw from this time of judgment upon his people. Rather, he says, but here's the good news, ve'od yado nituyah. In the midst of this, still, God's hand is outstretched. So in the midst of his judgment, there's still an opportunity to take hold of God's hand. It is an idiom of repentance, turning and embracing God. But if one doesn't, don't think that God's going to stop this judgment. And we see, primarily, this is going to be a judgment of the northern kingdom. Those 9 plus, usually we talk about the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom. And we know that that judgment really hasn't ceased, because there was not a formal redeeming of those individuals, bringing them back to the land like there was for the southern kingdom out of Babylon. We never saw that. Well, let's move now to the second session, or the second section of our study today. And this deals with how God is going to punish his people. This day of horrid outcome, this day of a catastrophe, God is going to bring his judgment, but there's going to be a vessel of his judgment. And who is that? I've already mentioned to you. It is Assyria. God is going to use Assyria, just like for Judah in the future. When I say future, Isaiah's time, he is going to use Babylon to bring about Judah's destruction, which he did over 2,500 years ago. But this is 2,700 years ago, what we're reading now. And the focus primarily, it foreshadows what the Babylonians are going to do, but its primary focus here is on Assyria and what happens to the northern kingdom. But Assyria does inflict a degree of punishment on that southern kingdom, Judah. Look now to verse 5. It begins with that same word, hoy. How awful, alas, woe. So he says, woe to Assyria, or we could say simply woe, because of Assyria, who has the rod or staff. Now, there's 2 words that we're to come across. The word here, shevet, and then the word mate. And both of them are very closely related to a rod or a staff. So it's not so important how we translate one and compare it to another, but it's the rod and the staff. So these 2 words. And he says, woe, and properly he's still saying woe to his people. Why? Because Assyria has the staff of my anger. And the rod, it is in their hand. And this rod represents Zami, which is my wrath. So God here again, oftentimes prophecy is poetic. It's speaking about God prophetically using Assyria, that people, in order to bring his judgment, his anger, and his wrath upon that northern kingdom. So he warns them he's going to use them. Verse 6. Against Goy Chanef. Chanef can be translated here as a hypocritical nation. By the way, the word here, nation, is the word Goy. But many times we see God's covenant people being called a Goy. So he writes, still this woe that is going to be against a hypocritical nation. He says, I will send it, and upon a people my wrath I will command it, to plunder the plunder and to take spoil the spoil. So this same words that we use earlier on in our study today, what we saw the people, the leadership doing in regard to the poor, God says he's going to do it to the entire nation. He is going to plunder and take spoil from them, and to put him, that is to put his people, mirmas. Mirmas is a trampling. So he is going to make them to be trampled as, notice how this verse ends, trampled as the Homer. Now, some will say it's the word mire of the streets. The word streets appears here. But it's a word for the material. And you have a street. It can be made of stone, of brick. Sometimes it's of the ground itself, and it's going to be trampled upon. And that's what he says. In the same way that a street is just trampled over, it's dirty, no one cares for the street too much. In that same way, God is going to bring Assyria upon primarily that northern kingdom, and they're going to be trampled upon as the mire, as the material of the street, what the street is made out of. Look at verse 7. And he, this would be Assyria. Assyria did not thus imagine, nor, it goes on to say, nor his heart did not think thusly. Now, what God is saying is this, and this is a huge principle that we need to learn. See, many times we need to remember, just because God uses someone doesn't mean that God's pleased with them, or the fact that he uses them is an affirmation that what they did was right or proper or of the right motivations. We've already been told God is going to use, and his history proves this out, that God is going to use Assyria to bring destruction to the northern kingdom. We know in 721, 722 BC, Assyria came and sent the northern tribes into exile, destroyed the nation of Israel, that northern nation. Also threatened and brought havoc, but not destruction, upon Judah. God delivered Judah from Assyria, as we've already talked about that he would in chapter 7. So he's saying here that Assyria, they did this, but they did not have any thoughts, any imaginations that they were doing this out of obedience for God. That's not their motivation to do that. What was their motivation? Keep reading in verse 7. For destruction was in his heart, and to cut down nations and not a few. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to expand Assyria. Their king wanted to expand their kingdom, taking control of many nations, not for any submissive purpose in light of God's will, not whatsoever. They did it out of anger and hatred for nations, including the nation of Israel. Verse 8, for he will say, surely my princes. And these would be nations that were either enslaved and brought under his authority, or those who entered into a confederacy with him. Sometimes that happened because they were enslaved and defeated. So Assyria will say, surely my princes. Altogether they are kings. He's trying to reveal how great he is, that his empire is an empire of a confederacy of kingdoms. He's taken these who he made princes, but in the past, altogether, they were kingdoms. And he gives example. Surely as Carchemish is Calno, and is not Arpad is made to be like Hamat, and also is not also as Damascus, so will be who? Shomron. So he's simply giving a list of different kingdoms that he has brought into his confederacy to cause them to submit. And what should stand out for God's people is Samaria. Shomron, oftentimes Bibles will say Samaria, that they too are under his authority. It's going to happen. They submitted because they were dominated by him. Verse 10, just as my hand found the kingdoms of idolatry. Now God is speaking. And he says, just as my hand, meaning his authority, God's using Assyria to bring these kingdoms of idolatry. That's what we just read in the previous verse. When we went through this list of kingdoms as Carchemish, Calno, Arpad, Hamat, Damasek, and Shomron. All of these were seats of power. And now they're under his authority. And God says, I did this. My hand found these kingdoms of idolatry. And their statutes, and this is a statue of they thought, power. That would cause them, these idols and these statues would cause them to have success in the world. God says, my authority, my hand is synonymous with power and authority. My hand found all of them. And he goes on to say, from Jerusalem and from Shomron, Samaria. Now, I realize that because the Hebrew here is somewhat difficult, somewhat choppy. Oftentimes, if you're looking into a literal translation, they will have many words in italicized to help you understand. And the point here is simply this. God has brought other nations under his submissiveness, caused them to cease to be, to brought destruction, and God will do that same thing. Notice what stands out here is Jerusalem and Shomron. Now, we would think, well, Samaria, sure, but also Jerusalem. It foreshadows what I've already alluded to, and that is in the same way that God used Assyria to bring destruction upon the northern kingdom called Israel. He will bring Babylon to bring destruction. After he brings destruction on the northern kingdom, approximately 140 years later, he'll bring that same destruction using Babylon to bring it upon Jerusalem and Judah. Verse 11. Surely, just as I have done to Samaria, Hebrew Shomron, and to her idols, thus I will do to Jerusalem and to her, and it's probably translated the same word, idols or images. It's a different word. Now, what's interesting is that this word is related to perhaps designing something. If you look carefully at it, we can see that it has to do with itzuv, which is designing. But it's also designing, usually specifically biblically, not in modern Hebrew, but biblically, designing or making idols or images. And that same word here is derived the word atzuv, which is sadness. Now it teaches us another wonderful principle. And that's why it's so important to pay attention to the original language. And I realize, and I commend those who do this, who go through and examine the text. But here's what happens. Oftentimes when we look at resources, especially Christian resources in Hebrew, they are oftentimes very inadequate. They will not give you a full tracing of that word. They give you many times just the predominant understanding. So they might, for example, and I did not look this up, but they might simply give you the definition to design or an idol or an image, that this is what this word means, and they'll never tell you that this same word is used to bring grief or sadness. So many of the things that we have in English, they are how can I say, condensed, and goes for the predominant, but doesn't do the tracking well. And sometimes they base their definitions and terms that they use for defining a word on predominant texts where this word appears, and not in secondary texts. And they don't show you the relationship between the predominant definition and a secondary definition and how they're related. That's where the real beauty is of doing original language studies. So the principle we have here is when we design images, the outcome is we're making ourselves sad. We're bringing grief upon ourselves. So never, when you invest in doing thorough word studies, and thorough word studies is not just simply going to a biblical dictionary or strong concordance or some software and seeing the 2-3 word definition that they give. That's inadequate. It's time. You need to see how many places that word appears in the Bible, and then go through all of those occurrences and see really what is the nature, the real meaning of that word. And then it can also help to go to extra biblical sources to see how that word was used in society at that same time. So all of this is very necessary in doing good Bible study. And let me say this, good Bible study is not done quickly. Verse 12. And it shall come about that he, who's the he here? The Lord. How do we know that? We have the word Adonai. And this is the word literally Adonai. Sometimes the 4-letter word Yud-He-Vav-He, which is commonly referred to as that sacred name, Jehovah God and such. Well, this is not that word. It's the word Adonai written out, Adonai. So the Lord, he will, and this could be my master, will perform all of his work. Where? On Mount Sion. Here again, what's surprising here is that there's references when predominantly this passage is about Shomron, Samaria, the northern kingdom. But there's sprinkling of Judah, Jerusalem, and Sion, that southern kingdom. He says, and it will come about that I will perform, that is, the Lord will perform all of his work on Mount Sion. And in Jerusalem, he says, I will visit. It's that same word for visitation, being all in, totally involved, upon the exalted fruit of the heart. Whose heart? The king of Assyria. Now, this is here, and it has very significant implications. It says that God, he did not make Assyria do this. He utilized what Assyria wanted to do in their own selfish, sinful desires. God used it for his purpose. He didn't cause it. And he says because what they did was wrong, their motivation, they didn't do it, Assyria, Babylon, they didn't do it out of a desire to serve and honor God. They did it for their own selfish reasons. And therefore God says, I'm all in against them. After I finish using them for what I want to do in Samaria and in Judah, in Jerusalem on Mount Zion, and there was a message to them. We've already saw that in chapter 7. He says, after I do that, I will visit. Some will say the pride of his heart, the exalted fruit of his heart. Whose heart? The king of Assyria. And upon the splendor of his haughty, his raised up eyes. And this is all about pride and arrogancy and doing what he wanted to do. No submissiveness, no thoughts to God's purpose, and therefore God will bring judgment upon Assyria as well. Verse 13. For I will say, my hand with power I have done this, and with wisdom, for I have functioned with understanding. Now, who's speaking here? He's quoting what the king of Assyria is saying. He's saying, with the power of my hand, I've done this. I brought destruction to Israel. And because with wisdom and with my understanding, I function. And I have removed the borders of the people. And I have stolen the treasures, their treasuries. And I will bring down the inhabitants as a valiant knight. It's the word here, avir, which is usually translated like a knight in King Arthur's Round Table, that medieval word for a knight. Well, this is a word for a valiant warrior in Hebrew. Modern Hebrew means a knight, means ancient times. This is what the king of Assyria is saying. I've done this. And notice how he's referring to himself. It was so easy. He says, my hand found like a nest the wealth of the peoples and their money. It was as though it was like eggs that were left in all the land. Everywhere he went, it was like the eggs in a nest were just abandoned, and he could just easily take it. He says, I have gathered, and I have not experienced what? No weighing. If there's a nest, you would expect that there would be the mother bird or the father bird. But he says, basically, no weighing was moved, and no mouth chirped. No mouth was open and chirped. He had total freedom to do this, he thought. But here's the problem. He did so in arrogance and in defiance against the will of God. Now, understand this properly. God used him. His actions accomplished the will of God, but he did not do it in obedience to the will of God. He did it for selfish purposes. He did it in defiance to what was right. What he did was not motivated from an inner quality of justice and judgment and righteousness and wanting to bring honor to God. That's not why Assyria did that. He did it, and he gives an example. Look at verse 15. Now, the first letter of the first word in verse 15, it's word ha yit pa'er. It's a word pa'ar is a glory because it's in the hit pa'el. It's a reflexive. It is to make oneself glorify oneself. And God asks a question. The first letter makes it a question. And he says, should an axe glorify itself over the one who chops with it? So if the end result of this work where you see the wood stacked up? Is the axe the one that should take pride in that, or the one who used the axe? Obviously, it's the one who used the axe. And should a saw exalt itself over the one who saws with it? Obviously, no, it's the one who uses it that gets the glory, not the saw. And as one who, we might say, moves the staff, should it do so against the one who raises it up? And the one who raises it up, the rod, okay, as though that he's not wood. So the point is this: a rod or a staff is usually made out of wood. And should that wood see himself greater than the one who utilized and perhaps made that staff? Obviously not. What God is saying is the pride, the arrogance of the king of Assyria was what motivated him. He gave no thought to his creator, to the Lord God Almighty. He did this with all pride and arrogance of his own self. And therefore, look now to the next verse, verse 16. Therefore, the Lord, this is the word ha-adon. We have the word Adonai, which is a form of this word, Adon, which is the master. Now we have the word Yud-He-Vav-He, the Lord of hosts, will send leanness, that which is skinny among the fat ones. So he's saying here, they're going to experience judgment. They may have had plentiful things, but they're going to go into leanness, into scarcity. And they're also going to experience, instead of his glory, meaning the king of Assyria and all of his glory, he is going to find that he, that is the Lord, will kindle a kindling of fire. So Assyria, God is allowing them because it serves his purpose, God's purpose. But the king of Assyria isn't interested in God's purpose. He is not acting, behaving in submissiveness to the will of God. None of that is an interest to him. God can use that for his purposes, but in the end, the king of Assyria and his empire are going to experience the judgment of God. Fire is going to be kindled against him. Verse 17. Now, it speaks about here, look at verse 17. Or Yisrael, the light of Israel, will become a fire, and his Holy One a flame. Now, many commentators speak about this as God and Messiah, God the Father and God the Son. So the light of Israel, Messiah says he's the light of the world. He's the light of Israel will become like fire. And his Holy One, the Holy One of Israel, will be a flame and burn and devour the thorns, his thorn and the thistle in one day. And if you know anything about the judgment that God put upon Assyria, it came rapidly. One day, no more the king of Assyria. His downfall was rapid. Judgment of God. So God is promising to do that, and then he says, keep reading, verse 18. And the glory of his force and of his fertile land, it's the word Carmel, the best land, is going to be devoid of life unto flesh. Meaning it's going to be judged. Remember, the term thorn and thistle means an abandoned land. God is going to cause it to be abandoned. This good land is not going to have any life in it and no flesh, no human existence. It's going to come to its end. And it shall be as, and there's many ways to translate this, it's simply saying that the one who has caused things to be ground up, meaning the one who has brought judgment, is going to melt away, going to be dissolved. So all it's speaking about here, and there's different ways, and it's difficult Hebrew to translate this, but it speaks about that which was will be grounded up, will melt away, will not be any more. Let's look at one more verse, verse 19. And the rest of the wood or the trees of his forest, what's left, what remains, he says, they will be in number that even a young child will be able to count them. So what is the end result of Assyria? And what will be the outcome for even Israel from God's judgment? There's only going to be a remnant left. And that concept is so important. So again, we see that when justice is denied, when legislation is enacted that is wicked, it is going to bring troublesome time upon the poor, the weak, the orphan, the widow. But in the end, God's going to get involved totally. He is going to bring judgment upon those, woe to them, that are leaders. And that whole nation is going to suffer. But in the end, there's going to be a remnant. And remember that God can do great things with a remnant. Well, I'll end with that until next week when we conclude chapter 10. May God bless you and shalom from Israel.
Well, we hope you will benefit from today's message and share it with others. Please plan to join us each week at this time and on this channel for our broadcast of LoveIsrael.org. Again, to find out more about us, please visit our website, LoveIsrael.org. There you will find articles and numerous other lectures by Baruch. These teachings are in video form. You may download them or watch them in streaming video. Until next week, may the Lord bless you in our Messiah Yeshua, that is Jesus, as you walk with Him. Shalom from Israel.